thing for week 11 on Sean Baker's Tangerine. Okay, so Tangerine, which was written and directed by Sean Baker, was released in 2015. Um, and the film gathered kind of immediate attention because it was shot on a series of iPhone 5s. Although Baker did use a specific kind of adapter which enabled him to do wide shot, and he also treated the footage in post production, and he used professional sound recording. So this is by no means a film that anyone could go out and shoot with an iPhone. But the iPhone was the kind of primary camera, albeit a modified version of it, through which he shot the film. And yeah, so it's a comedy drama, I guess you could say, which follows two trans sex workers living in LA, and it's set on Christmas Eve, so it's technically a Christmas movie. And the main plot features Cindy, who has just finished a 28-day jail sentence and learns from her friend and also trans sex worker Alexandra that her boyfriend and her pimp, who is named Chester, cheated on her while she was in prison. And from this point, which happens, that kind of revelation comes right in the first scene of the movie, just after Cindy has kind of gotten out of jail. And she tries to track down Chester, which is the main part of the movie, but the film also shows us the details between Alexandra and Cindy. It shows us kind of Alexandra at work, and it also shows us there's a subplot involving a taxi driver, who is one of the sex workers' clients, and his family. But we don't. I mean, I think that that's an interesting part of the movie, but we're not really going to talk about it so much today. Obviously, if you wanted to write anything about Tangerine, or you wanted to work on it for your oral, then you might want to consider that part of the film too. But yeah, the movie ends in a long confrontation with Chester in Donut Time, which is the same kind of fast food store that the movie opens in, somewhere in Hollywood. The whole film is set in the Hollywood part of Los Angeles. Which in and of itself is kind of interesting because obviously we associate Hollywood with glamour, we associate it with movie stars, and we also associate it, thinking about it, with that huge sign that says the words Hollywood, which we never see in the movie. So right away, when we're thinking about Tangerine, and this is something that I'm going to go on about quite a lot, is that we want to think about the way in which it shows us a kind of Los Angeles and a kind of Hollywood, which is not, which if we live there, we might recognize, but as people from outside of the city, we don't see any of the kind of distinctive Hollywood features that we would see, with the exception of one scene in which we see the Hollywood Boulevard stars. It doesn't really appear to be the kind of Hollywood that we would recognize from the movies, quote unquote. So yeah, following this confrontation, there's a final revelation that Alexandra also slept with Chester, and this appears to have kind of ended their friendship. But then Cindy is the victim of a transphobic assault. She gets urine thrown on her from a car, and then Alexandra kind of accompanies her to a laundrette and helps her get cleaned up, and the two appear to have kind of reconciled. And that's the end of the movie. So, the first thing to mention about Tangerine, or something that I think is interesting, is that it appears to be in lots of ways, not completely, but in lots of ways, a kind of modern version of what in the middle of the 20th century was referred to as neorealism. And neorealism is a very influential cinema movement which emerged in the early years after World War II. It was largely in Italy, but not exclusively. And some of the most famous directors were Roberto Rossellini, Luchino Visconti, and Vittorio De Sica. Excuse the terrible Italian attempt at an accent there. And these directors made films which focused on working class characters living lives which we were not used to kind of seeing on screen. And they often made these characters into kind of tragic figures who were overwhelmed by economic forces beyond control, but who faced life with this kind of nobility and courage, which hadn't really been seen before. These weren't really subjects of films in the same way that Visconti, Rossellini, and De Sica made them subjects of films. If we're thinking about Tangerine as a neorealist work, we also want to think about, I think, the way in which actually Baker does not. The film is not a tragedy. The film features situations which are obviously difficult and situations that we might not want to affirm as being good, but at the same time, Baker does not patronize his characters, and he does not really, I think, want us to feel sorry for them, and he doesn't judge any of the characters actually. And I think that if we were seriously going to consider Tangerine as a piece of neorealism, then we would want to take that into account as well. However, that's a bit of a tangent. So, yeah, neorealist films are made with a low budget, they're shot on location, and they often made use either of amateur actors or of first-time movie stars. While these aspects of the film kind of defined their aesthetic, so if you think of neorealist cinema, you think of low budget, you think of gritty urban locations, you think of actors who are not so much playing a role as representing the class that they come from as people. These are all of those features of neorealist cinema were in some ways dictated by the kind of financial constraints that the directors were under, at least at the start of their careers. Just to give an example, Rossellini shot Rome Open City on a particular kind of grainy black and white film because that was all that he could afford at the time. However, those restraints, those restrictions then kind of get sucked into the cinematic process, and they become the defining aesthetic of the movie. So they become something, if not entirely positive, they become something which is used in the film. So they're not merely a limitation, they're actually something which contains its own kind of creative potential, you could say. And Tangerine shares that trait, especially. So Baker stated in interviews that although his decision to shoot on an iPhone was motivated by money, or to shoot on iPhones, sorry, he didn't just use one phone for the whole film. You can see that in the shots, that there's a variety of different cameras in some of the scenes. He was also aware that this this technique, this way of shooting, would give the film kind of unique aesthetic qualities. So, like the neorealists, Baker turned budget limitations into a kind of positive quality, and he took advantage of the unique aesthetic in order to make it kind of an essential part of the film. We'll see how he does that next. So one of the qualities of the iPhone, of the way that he shoots, is that it doesn't really have a depth of field. So as he says, everything's in focus. And what we mean by depth of field is some things are in focus either in the background or the foreground, and some things are out of focus either in the background or the foreground. And this is a very standard cinematographic feature. It's in kind of photographic stills as well. And it's used, for example, to create the kind of blurred crowd shots in Taxi Driver, or the kind of picturesque, almost some of the almost like impressionist moments in When Harry Met Sally, when the kind of autumn colors create this kind of dreamy texture. But the camera in Tangerine doesn't do that. I mean, it can't do that, actually. It doesn't have the same kind of depth of field as other film cameras do. And this does create a kind of very singular aesthetic quality for the film. And once you've noticed it, you kind of can't unsee it. Or I found that I couldn't unsee it once I'd read Baker talking about the quality that he thought the camera brought to his film. And we can just give an example of this if we look at the cafe scene. Um, Actually, no, we'll look at a different scene. We'll look at the scene where Cindy kind of exits the cafe. You can watch the cafe scene on eCampus. I'll upload it on YouTube. I don't have it queued up now, so there's no point in showing it to you. However, if we watch this scene, this is a scene. But sorry, guys, I'm in a bit of a muddle. This is a scene. So this is a scene when Cindy exits Donut Time right at the start of the film. So she's just found out that Chester has cheated on her. And again, look at how crisp the kind of images. Look at the way, like, you can see everything in the background just as much as you can see the foreground. Again, right the way back. Obviously, not everything is clear because there's still a kind of distance, but you do get this kind of crisp effect.
Merry fucking Christmas.
Good line. And again, we can see kind of people walking down the street in LA. Sometime in the morning, we can see all the kind of signs for all the kind of stores that Cindy is passing as she kind of marches down. We see the advert for a restaurant called Crown of India. So we get this sense that the city is really vibrant. Obviously, the blue sky and the lighting is doing something too, or the light and the sun is doing something too. And what I want to argue is that this kind of creates like a leveling effect. It places Alexandra and Cindy within the kind of texture of the city in general, or the city overall. They're not overwhelmed by a kind of crowd like Deckard is in Blade Runner, and also the city can't really function as a backdrop as it does in Harry Met Sally, because you just don't really get the aesthetic distinction between the location of the characters and the location of the city. They're not, one is not set against the other. Rather, everything is kind of taking place in some way on the same level. And yeah, we get this also in this. This, I think, is an especially interesting way of shooting LA, is what I'm going to say. The Big Nowhere is a nickname for LA. One of the ways in which LA is referred to sometimes in literature and in film and in kind of cultural history. And yeah, we get the kind of focusing quality of the iPhone and obviously the very vibrant color scheme throughout the movie, and the lively soundtrack that we just heard a little bit of. And all of this kind of highlights the frenetic energy of Cindy as she's searching for Chester. But at the same time, we also, most of the film takes place in either on street corners or in kind of generic locations that don't really have a personality of their own, but are kind of a, like we said in relation to Blade Runner, kind of like a hyper real copy of a copy of a copy. You have a kind of generic donut store called Donut Time, a bar on Hollywood Boulevard that could be anywhere, a Mexican restaurant that could be any Mexican restaurant, and just street corners, which are just places where different locations meet but have no real identity of their own. And like I say, these are transient places, and their transience matches the kind of rootless quality of Alexander and Cindy's lives as they move from location to location without properly establishing kind of roots or lasting purposes. Obviously, Cindy is kind of on a mission in the film, so she is moving from place to place with a kind of purpose. But at the same time, we do get the sense that their lives very much revolve around these kind of locations that in and of themselves don't really mean anything. However, and we can say that that's a quality that Marx and others thought was kind of part of, again, the lumpen condition, this condition of kind of being a bit of a vagabond, of not really having a fixed abode, of not really having anywhere to go, but of always moving around from location to location. And again, this is something that we really associate with Los Angeles, especially, which is a city which is famous for being disconnected, for feeling like there is no overarching identity within the city itself. And yeah, we see in Double Indemnity, just to give a flashback to the, to the start of the course. I mean, or not the start, but near the start of the course. If you remember, Walter just kind of has this throwaway comment about how Dietrichson's house is this kind of was built according to this quite short-lived fashion for Spanish architecture, which makes it stand out. But also LA, where Double Indemnity is set as well, and Blade Runner is set, is just this kind of, it's like individual locations which have their own style, which can be very arbitrary and can often obey fashions that were very popular but then went out of fashion very quickly. So you don't get this kind of overarching sense of really anywhere at all. And what we see is that in Tangerine, we see this kind of this class of people whose life is kind of, I'd say here, stitched together by moving between these kind of interchangeable, kind of nothingy urban locations, but at the same time, Baker kind of uses his soundtrack, he uses his color, and he uses like the energy of the actors themselves to kind of invest these spaces which have almost no personality with this kind of very intense drama at points. And yeah, and you get this kind of, you can call it here like lumpen color, this sense that while the characters in Tangerine, the majority of them are firmly in the surplus population, we don't get either the kind of fear, the uncertainty, the pity, any of those kind of negative qualities that we would associate, or that we've seen other films associate that class of people with, even though that presentation was sometimes complicated. For example, with Jodie Foster's character in Taxi Driver, we just don't get that in Tangerine. It's not a film which is really trying to make any judgment about these people. It's just trying to, it's kind of realistic and it's showing us their lives. At the same time, it's obviously quite a exceptional day in the life of its characters. But the whole kind of vibrancy and the energy of the film is one which is quite devoted to showing just how intense these lives are, just how meaningful these lives are, even though they might appear to a more conservative viewer to be incorrigible or to be immoral. The movie doesn't really give a fuck about that. It's just showing you its characters, and it gives a lot of energy to them and allows them to express a lot of energy. And yeah, another thing which ties the movie into the history of neorealism is the way in which it kind of features depictions of work, often humorous depictions of work. We see this in the kind of scene in which Alexandra fights the guy we call John, which is American slang for the client of a sex worker, over whether or not he's going to pay her, and we see the kind of cops intervening in that too. And it's a funny scene, like he finds comedy in this scene, and there's no way in which it's intended to be, in which Alexandra is presented as a victim. She's clearly capable of looking after herself, and she's clearly pretty fearless when it comes to standing up for herself. And if we can watch this scene where they kind of encounter the cops, I'll link out on eCampus too. Oh, turn the sound on.
And I put him down. She drinks out of my straw.
And again, we can see the focus notice how the cops are in the foreground, but we can see
Nice.
Alexandra
Just
and
classy,
John
huh?
very clearly
Wait a
at the
minute.
back of the
Making
scene.
it classy.
Nice.
Oh, jeez.
Oh boy.
Fucking Alexander.
Oh boy.
And they know each other, so we get this kind of sense that the police and the sex workers in the movie have this kind of continuous relationship, which may be true, you know. The cops whose job it is to kind of manage the lumpen population in some way, also clearly know them by name.
Have you not worked with Alexander?
No.
Help me, please,
Hey,
help me.
off the
Guys,
car.
I'm in a car,
Off
shit,
the
help.
fucking car.
Get off me, help.
Well,
Guys,
here's your chance if you want to go meet him.
officer, please,
try.
help me, officer.
Alexandra!
Officer,
Alexandra!
officer, help.
All right, that's enough. Let him go. What's going on?
And again, I think something which is interesting about Tangerine is the way in which the city just kind of continually keeps on going in the background. Just this car driving past now. But again, not in a way that is like a backdrop, not in a way which separates the characters from the city or which frames the characters with the city, but just you continually get the impression that they're just kind of immersed in it.
Attack me.
He owes me fucking money. Is this true?
No, you don't even know her. Get out of my car, she just attacked me.
So a random woman just grabs you and starts attacking you? Yes.
Check the pulse.
And again, we see the cars coming. I mean, these are not staged cars. This scene was just shot in the middle of the city, and Baker just did it at a certain point in the day in which traffic was passing up and down the road.
Alexander.
Girl, what the fuck? You know I don't do that shit.
I don't know. What's happening?
He owes me money.
I
He
do
owes
not
me
owe you money.
$40?
I don't even know her.
Why does he owe you
He knows
$40?
me very well. Ask him.
Is that your free Passat?
Yeah,
Well, we've seen you cruising around for at least 45 minutes. So you didn't just park.
I just-
Come down.
like 10 minutes ago, I was driving around. I was on the
I've
phone. I
seen
realized
you know what,
I
sir?
shouldn't be talking and driving. I
That's
called.
it. That's it. Why does he owe you money?
We made a business transaction.
We made a business transaction. So again, we kind of see like I'll talk about this a bit later on, but we see the ways in which kind of certain codes of life and certain rules are in place in the kind of city or the kind of experience of the city in which Alexandra lives and in which she works, which kind of enable her to get by, right? And obviously the cop knows what's going on straight away. She's kind of wise to it too. And what you have is both a very fun, I think, like a pretty funny scene, a scene that kind of highlights Alexandra's agency and her like willingness to stand up for herself, and also a scene which shows just the kind of different relations between cops and sex workers, different ways in which different groups of people experience and manage their lives within the city, especially from the kind of the specific perspective of a kind of lumpen or of a kind of surplus population. And as we said in relation to Blade Runner, the police themselves are not usually thought of as being members of the surplus population, but definitely a major part, if not the major part of their role is to manage it and to kind of keep it in check in some way or another. Sorry, wrong direction. Okay, so yeah, the realistic depictions of work, issues relating to employment and the lives of domestic circumstances of workers, especially in Italy, is a feature of neorealism. We don't see much domestic work in Tangerine, but definitely the focus on work itself is something that the movie shares with neorealism. However, as I say, and the scene that we just kind of watched a bit of is a good example of this. Like, Tangerine presents these scenes without sensationalizing them, and it shows the way that they form a part of the lives of the characters, and it finds comedy in them, which is something, as I said before, and I'll repeat now, which is something that could also, in some ways, differentiate the film from neorealist cinema, or at least traditional neorealist cinema, which at times was criticized for making everything into kind of a tragedy in some way, which is not totally accurate, but is certainly a tendency to create these kind of very beautiful but very tragic stories of workers doing their best but failing in the end because they can't, because the forces against them are just too overwhelming. And there's a kind of humanist element to that, which Tangerine is not really interested in, because it's not trying to pass judgment on its characters. It doesn't feel sorry for them. It's just showing you how their life works, and it finds a kind of vibrancy and joy in that. And a part of that is the kind of circularity. And yeah, I mentioned this as a kind of deliberate contrast to When Harry Met Sally. Obviously, these two films are very different, but they are movies. They are both comedies. Sorry, obviously they're both movies. They're both comedies, and they both involve an element of romance and both about friendship. So they do have things in common, aside from the fact they're both funny. But yeah, Tangerine has at its core something like the circularity of the lives of the characters. It's set over the course of a day, so it starts in the morning, it ends at night. And even that itself gives a kind of circular quality. We know the next day will come, and we don't know if it, obviously it probably won't be the same day, but a lot of the things that we see are likely to be repeated, especially the work and probably the drugs too. So yeah, nonetheless, it has this kind of tangible opening. Cindy has just been released from jail. We learn in the kind of final long scene that the reason that she was in jail is because Chester asked her to hold drugs so that he wouldn't get a more serious charge. And this kind of marks a kind of new start for Cindy. But at the same time, we get the sense that the events are going to repeat themselves. Interactions with the police are an everyday fact of life. We just saw that the cops know Alexandra by name, and they know what her work is. She says, "You kind of know why I was doing this." She calls it a business transaction. And yeah, this suggests that both Cindy's work and her relationship and her drugs and her interactions with the police are going to repeat themselves. And the narrative of the film does have an arc and a conclusion. She finds Chester, she falls out with Alexandra, and then the two reconcile. But at the same time, we get this sense of a kind of daily pattern. And again, while we see a kind of development, at the same time we also see a kind of we don't really see a way out for any of the characters. It's certainly not for Cindy and Alexandra. But again, I don't think the film presents this as tragic, and I don't think it's obviously the situations of the characters in lots of ways are not good, but at the same time it's not trying to make us feel pity for them. It doesn't want us to think of them as kind of victims trapped without a future, but at the same time, this kind of moving from work to work, from job to job, has a cyclical quality to it, as does drugs, as does drug use and drug addiction. We see in one scene that Cindy is smoking meth, which is highly addictive, and which, again, addiction creates this kind of circularity. You move from hit to hit to hit to hit, without much of a sense of progression. And this does form part of the kind of comedy of Tangerine, but at the same time it also forms part of its realism, because this is what one, as I said, this is the kind of thing that one would associate with the life of a kind of lumpen class, or with the life of the surplus population. the life of people who do not have the kind of security that Harry and Sally have, which allows them to engage in these kind of existential developments and adventures and emotional crises, and these kind of long projected trajectories. We know that Cindy and Alexandra will change over time because everyone does, but the quality of that change and the way that it is projected within the film is very, very different to When Harry Met Sally. And one of the reasons that's different is because the characters are from obviously very different class backgrounds. So, final point to do with the way that the kind of tapestry of the city works again in Tangerine. The final sequence begins with an abusive assault on Cindy, something which would also be a part of everyday life of women in her position in the US. Trans women are regularly victims of often fatal violence, and sex workers are especially vulnerable because of the nature of their work. That's just true. However, Tangerine doesn't, again, it's not dwelling on this as something which means that we need to feel pity for its characters. Something which it's also doing is showing us the way in which networks of communication and solidarity and also competition like organize and inform how sex work functions in the Hollywood era of Los Angeles. So we see the way in which Alexandra helps her friends straight away and knows the location of a laundrette where they can get cleaned up. We don't know if she's had to do that herself before. It's very likely that she has. And again, the laundrette is another transient location. So we see the way in which the lives of the characters is organized around these transient, nondescript locations. Every laundrette is like every other laundrette. I'm sure you guys know this if you use laundrettes in Paris too, or anywhere actually. Pretty much every laundrette in the world is like every other laundrette in the world. And at several points, we see that other sex workers know the location of each other, and that certain completely innocuous-looking streets contain their own codes. Again, one of the funny scenes in the movie, the scene that I think is deliberately funny in the movie, is when the Armenian cab driver picks up someone, or is cruising, and he accidentally picks up a cis sex worker and gets angry with her and tells her that she shouldn't be working that corner because that corner is quote unquote not for pussies. And again, this is funny. It's not a judgmental sequence. I don't think that the movie wants us to judge those characters either the Armenian cab driver, whose name I can't remember, or his family. Which again doesn't mean that we want to say that they're good people, but it's just not about, it doesn't carry this kind of moral weight to it in any way. I think that's one of its most interesting and most refreshing qualities, actually. But again, we see the way that innocuous areas of the city, street corners, contain their own codes and contain their own rules. And the way that sex workers know where each other are, like they look out for each other, and sometimes they're in competition, and they can be quite cruel to each other when they're talking. Like people joke at Cindy or make fun of Cindy because she's kind of thinks that Chester could ever possibly be loyal to her, or thinks that she's his girlfriend. But the flip side of that is that we see that sex workers know the corners that each other works. We know that they would look out for each other. If people go missing, they know where they are. And again, this is something which in the kind of lives of sex workers, especially those who kind of work street corners, is often a question of survival. You know, like you need to know that your friends know where you are. Because it can be a desperately vulnerable job sometimes. And again, Tangerine shows us this kind of world which, when Travis Bickle looks at it from outside of his cab, what he sees is this kind of heaving mass of trash. But what Tangerine shows us, which is kind of what we knew all along, is that actually this is quite a complicated world, quite a world of emotional and geographical complexity, but also a kind of a world of norms, friendships, and betrayals, and rules, and like kind of hyper organized rules, which enable people to survive. And again, throughout the film, Baker's kind of camera work, together with the energy of his cast, like invest these locations with a kind of energy and a drama, which I would argue rivals anything that one would find in kind of recognizable areas of a city. So the kind of places of the city that we see in When Harry Met Sally, in which we instantly know that this is New York. And I think just the final bit that I will show you is the scene outside of the metro station, which is also quite early in the film. But just to close on this, and again, we see public transport is again a transient place, a transient bit of a city by definition. It's not somewhere which is a place in and of itself. It's somewhere which you use to get to other places. But in this scene in which Cindy kind of marches out of the Mexican restaurant, we again get a sense that she invests even the most transient of locations with this kind of energy. And we get this from the colour and the music and her own kind of acting style. And again, market traders and kind of these are also people without kind of fixed jobs. These are people who inhabit the kind of surplus areas of the city and sell surplus goods. Again, we see the people walking past. We see the realistic quality. The sky is super vibrant, but at the same time, it's nowhere.
Excuse me. Hey, excuse me. Hello, do you have a light? Thank you.
Look at the way that the color of the hair and the red on the lamppost and the blue of the sky and the color of the sign and the color of that sign and the green on the trees. Like, he's really, sorry, I keep repeating this, but he's really, really bringing out the textures of a certain kind of urban life in these shots. But at the same time, this is taking place in a situation which is, yeah, it's nowhere. It's a metro station. I mean, we know it's Vermont and Santa Monica, but we don't see any of the kind of recognizable monuments or highlights of Los Angeles. We just get this sense of a transient, disconnected space. And obviously, final point is that the metro itself, the underground, is somewhere where you go in somewhere and you appear somewhere else. It's the most like non-space of non-spaces, you could say. And all of that is going on in Baker's vision of what Los Angeles is, but at the same time, his shooting technique, is his aesthetic, and the energy of the characters is investing this with a kind of drama which would be very difficult to feel in other films or for other methods of shooting.